Okay guys, we're going to continue our talk on neuroanatomy. Okay, so the nervous system we know is a really complex hierarchical structure, and it's composed of around 100 billion neurons. And each neuron communicates directly with 2,000 other neurons. So neurons we're using them as communication in our brain, and the interaction of neurons provides at least 1 trillion points of communication. So we can divide the nervous system into the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. The CNS includes the brain, and you all remember the parts of the brain that include the cerebrum, which is the cerebral cortex, the cerebellum, the subcortical structures, the brainstem, and the spinal cord. Then the peripheral nervous system, the PNS, this is composed of 12 pairs of cranial nerves, 31 pairs of spinal nerves, and sensory receptors. Okay, then we can further subdivide the nervous system into the autonomic nervous system and the somatic nervous system. So the autonomic nervous system, this controls involuntary activities of your viscera, of your glands, and things like that. So, and then we can subdivide it into the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. So, do you remember the sympathetic nervous system? I'm sure you've learned this before in biology. The sympathetic nervous system is that fight or flight response that you have. And then the parasympathetic nervous system is what's calming you down after that fight or flight response. Okay, then the somatic nervous system, this controls voluntary bodily functions. Okay, so the autonomic system controls involuntary activities like glandular secretions, heart function, digestive function. And then the somatic nervous system is controlling bodily functions, but voluntarily. Okay, so the most basic component of the nervous system is a neuron, also known as a nerve cell, and these are the functional building blocks for the nervous system. And the main role is to transmit information. So you can see the parts of the neuron. So we see the cell body, or the soma, here. The dendrites extend out here. The dendrites transmit information toward the cell body. Then the axon, all along here, transmits information away from the cell body. Okay, we are not going to talk about these types of cells. All right, neurotransmitters. These are compounds that are responsible for activating the next neuron in a chain of neurons. And so in order for neurons to communicate, it's the neurotransmitters that are being released to be able to activate that communication. So a neurotransmitter is released into the gap between two neurons. So we see the end of one neuron here, and this is the beginning of another neuron here. Do you see how these open up here? And this is the space here is called the synaptic cleft, and the neurons go through the synaptic cleft to reach the postsynaptic neuron, the next neuron. Okay, so when a neuron is stimulated, the axon discharges the neurotransmitter into the synaptic cleft. So the neurotransmitter is like a key to a door, and it's when the neurotransmitter is released, the adjacent neuron will respond. Then when the postsynaptic neuron, so when this neuron is stimulated, the ion channels in its membranes open up and allow the ions to enter, and this is what causes a firing of that neuron. I would highly recommend that you read in your book how this works, and in the next lecture I have also posted a video that will show you how neurotransmitters are released. Okay, so we've already talked about the spinal cord before, but it's part of the central nervous system, and it's the information lifeline to and from the periphery of the body. Okay, so we're sending information from our brain out to the periphery of our body, out to our limbs through our spinal cord, and then we're sensing information, and then that's getting sent up to our spinal cord, up to our brain. Okay, we are going to skip this. What I do want you to know is that efferent tracts, this transmits data from the brain to the spinal nerves. Okay, so when we want to think about moving a muscle, we're using our efferent tracts because it's taking information from our brain and sending it to our spinal nerves. The afferent tracts, these transmit data about limbs and our trunk up to the higher brain centers. Okay, so the spinal nerves, we have 31 pairs of spinal nerves that are entering and exiting the spinal cord, and all spinal nerves contain both sensory and motor fibers. Okay, so now we also have cranial nerves, which are more specialized than the spinal nerves. And we have 12 cranial nerves, and they transmit information to and from the face and neck, and we number them with Roman numerals from 1 to 12, and it's numbered in the order of emergence from the brainstem. So you can see this is a picture of the brainstem, and the cranial nerves exiting the brainstem. I will not ask you to diagram anything like this. These are all the cranial nerves, so olfactory, optic, oculomotor, trochlear, trigeminal, abducens, facial, vestibular, cochlear, also called the auditory nerve, glossopharyngeal, the vagus, accessory, and hypoglossal. Now, the ones that we are going to focus on will be the ones that are significant for speech. But if you need to learn all of them, you can use this mnemonic. Once one takes the anatomy final, very good vacations are heavenly. It's one way to help you remember all 12 of the cranial nerves. Okay, and here's a picture of the cranial nerves to help you remember what they do. So olfactory is our sensory system, optic is our eyes. Anyway, it's just a depiction that you can look at. So now we're going to talk about the ones that are specific that I do really want you to know. I can guarantee you this will be on the exam, that you need to know these next cranial nerves that we talk about in detail. Okay, so cranial nerve 5. So I would know the Roman numeral and the name. So cranial nerve 5, the trigeminal nerve, there are 3 branches: the ophthalmic, the maxillary, and the mandibular. So you see the ophthalmic here, maxillary, and mandibular. Okay, so the ophthalmic branch is entirely sensory. Okay, so it's just processing touch, pressure, pain, temperature from the areas of the face. It's just processing sensory information. The maxillary nerve is only sensory as well, and it transmits information from the lower eyelid, the skin on the sides of the nose, the upper jaw, the teeth, the lips, and the mucosal lining of the buccal and nasal cavities, maxillary sinuses, and the nasopharynx. Okay, so the maxillary is sensory only. It's providing all the sensory information for this region here on the face. Now, the mandibular is the only one that is both sensory and motor. So you can see the space here. So it's motor for the muscles of mastication, so the muscles of chewing, the tensor veli palatini, and some of the extrinsic laryngeal muscles. And then it's also providing the sensory information for this area of the face. Okay, cranial nerve 7 is the facial nerve. This is a really complex nerve, as you can see. Here in yellow, here's the facial nerve. It supplies nerve impulses to muscles of facial expression, the stapedius muscle in the middle ear, and some extrinsic laryngeal muscles. It also is providing the sense of taste from the anterior 2/3 of the tongue. Okay, so cranial nerve 8, this is the vestibular cochlear, also called the auditory nerve, and there's two branches, the vestibular branch and the cochlear branch. The vestibular branch, these fibers innervate the semicircular canals in your ear, and it transmits balance information. The cochlear portion innervates inner hair cells in the cochlea, and so this is transmitting auditory information. Okay, so vestibular, think balance, cochlear, think hearing. Cranial nerve 9, this is the glossopharyngeal nerve, and it's involved with sensory of the outer ear and eustachian tube. Also, it's involved with taste for the posterior 1/3 of the tongue, motor of the salivary gland, and neural impulse of pharyngeal muscles. Okay, cranial nerve 10, this is a really important complex cranial nerve. It provides sensory information for the external ear, the taste buds of the epiglottis, the thoracic and abdominal viscera, the larynx, the pharynx, the trachea, and the esophagus. Okay, so that's providing a lot of sensory information to a lot of parts that are really important for speech. Now it's providing the motor for the soft palate, the pharynx, the larynx, heart rate, thoracic and abdominal smooth muscles for digestions, and the glands of the endocrine system. So cranial nerve 11, this is the hypoglossal, and the motor innervates intrinsic and extrinsic muscles of the tongue and some extrinsic laryngeal muscles. Okay, so these are the cranial nerves that I'm going to ask you about on the exam that are specific to speech. So the ones that we've talked about, make sure you know which ones provide sensory information and motor information and what it provides that information for.